Very good evening to you, and warm welcome to St John's Downshire Hill this evening. We are delighted to welcome Andrew Sach, who is joining me here on the screen. And Andrew is the one of the ministers of Grace Church in Greenwich. And you can tell us a bit more about yourself, Andrew, and your background and things.
Hey, good to be with you. I can only see Tom, but I think there's some other people on YouTube unseen by me, but thanks for tuning in tonight. I'm sitting pretty much on the Greenwich Meridian line right now. So it's my claim to fame is that the East meets West line runs through my house and through my bedroom. And I reckon if I sit exactly here, then about half of me is in the Eastern Hemisphere and half's in the West. What do you want to know about me, Tom? Well,
tell us a bit about your background, your interest in science, and how you came to be a Christian.
Okay, so I started getting into science at school because, my stepbrother and I made an explosives factory in my parents' garage, which is the sort of thing nowadays that would get you on a GCHQ sort of monitoring watch list. But back in the 1980s, that was just fun. And my stepfather was a scientist, and he had all these stories of chemicals he used to make when he was a child, and we tried to make the same things. So the thing I most wanted to make was a substance called nitrogen triiodide, which is so unstable when it's dry that it explodes on touch. And my stepfather had stories of spreading some of this thinly on the windowsill and waiting for the cat, and it would tread on it and then bang, and a big puff of purple smoke. So we were desperate to make this and various other explosive things. So I went off to Cambridge to study, initially chemistry, natural sciences, but I did mainly chemistry. And then the chemistry was too difficult by the time I was wrestling with quantum mechanics. So by the third year, I'd switched to neuroscience, and I went on to do a PhD in that. But also by the time I finished university, I'd gone from being an atheist to being a Christian. So it was a time of lots of changes for me.
Okay, and just tell us then how that change came about for you.
Well, it was a process, but I think it started because I met some Christians at university who didn't fit my stereotype of religious people. So I wouldn't have put it this rudely to their face, but I basically thought that Christians were gullible hypocrites. I'm gullible because I'd not heard good reasons why I should believe it, and hypocrites because I read the papers and I knew about the scandals in the church. And so I just dismissed it really until I met some people in my first year at university who were Christians, and they weren't gullible. I mean, they really had thought it through. They had reasons for what they believed, which was a surprise to me. And they weren't hypocrites. So they said that they wanted to follow the Lord Jesus, and it really did change the way that they behaved in quite an extraordinary way, and it got my attention. And that didn't mean it was true, but it meant it couldn't be dismissed so easily. So I started sort of thinking about it for the first time. One of the things they said to me, which is sort of now enormously obvious, but just wasn't obvious to me as an 18-year-old, was that Jesus was a real historical person. And that meant that certain questions about him were objective things rather than just a matter of opinion. So, when it comes to flavors of ice cream, I might think that vanilla is the best and you might think chocolate is the best, and we can both be right. But when it comes to the Battle of Hastings, if you say it was in 1166, you're just wrong and you're going to fail your history GCSE. So historical things either happened or they didn't happen. And I just realized that if Jesus was historical, he was in that kind of category. So who was he actually? I mean, did he exist? And if he did exist, did he die on a cross? And if he did die on a cross, did he come back from the dead? And if he did come back from the dead, that was true or false, independent of my opinion about it. And I wanted to know whether it was really true. So it became a sort of checkable, historical, factual question. And I mean, you can ask me more about this, but I became convinced that it was true. It really did happen. But you'd think that meant I'd become a Christian, but actually I didn't, because the second thing was I thought, okay, this is probably true, but I didn't want it to be true because I thought that following Jesus would wreck my life. And I just had this fear that being a Christian would be to be grey and boring and anti-fun. In fact, one of my friends was commenting recently on Jesus' miracle when he turned water into wine at a wedding. And he said this was a great surprise to him, not that Jesus was able to perform the various miraculous chemistry, because H2O to C2H5OH doesn't go. And that's ignoring all of the complex wine chemistry of vanillins and tannins and so on. That wasn't the thing that surprised him. He was surprised by the fact that if Jesus had that kind of power, he wouldn't go around turning wine into water. Because his suspicion about God was that God's greatest fear was that somebody somewhere might be enjoying themselves and he had to stamp it out. So I think that was my fear about Christianity. So I thought it's probably true. I don't want it to be true. And the final thing that convinced me was that Jesus wasn't just true factually, but he's also good, and he loved me and I could trust him with my life. And that was the final step. So yeah, that was in my first year at university, which is quite a long time ago. I'm now 45 years old. I can't do the maths, but it's quite a while ago.
Okay, so let me just say to those who are watching on YouTube, hello and welcome if you've joined us since the start. And I'm Tom Watts. I'm the minister of St John's, Downshire Hill. I'm talking to Andrew Sach, who has introduced himself. We're talking about science and God, and we're going to be talking a little bit about COVID-19 as well. And if you have a question that arises from what you hear, whether it's just probing a bit more deeply into something, or whether it's something that we haven't raised that you would like to hear answered in this area, please do put it in the chat, and you can find that on YouTube. So if you're watching this on a TV or something, you might struggle to see the chat, but if you go and look on a phone or on your computer, you'll see the live chat kind of there next to where you're watching, and you can type in a question there, and we'll take those as they come. I've got plenty of questions, plenty of things to ask Andrew, so we're going to get going some things now. So let's think a bit about the current situation and COVID-19, which is affecting all of us in different ways. We see scientists, the profile of scientists has been massively raised, even more than ever through this crisis. We see, often have the scientists standing next to the minister, whoever it is, at the daily briefing in number 10. We want to hear about the science. Well, I mean, from your point of view, what do you make of that? And to what extent can we look to science to save us in a time like this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very grateful for science. I think it's a powerful thing, and it's done lots of good in the society. It's also enables us to do lots of harm. We can kill more people with explosives than we used to be able to with atomic bombs, but we can also rescue people from all kinds of cancers, and maybe one day we'll get the vaccine or the treatment for coronavirus. So science is great, and certainly belief in God doesn't mean you don't want doctors or scientists, just like believing in God doesn't mean you don't want farmers. I mean, God's given us the ability to grow food to eat, to keep ourselves alive. He's given us policemen to stop people stabbing us in the streets. He's given us doctors to treat us when we're ill. And I think I'm as grateful for that as the next person is. And I hope when I'm ill, I'll go to hospital, and I hope they've got some treatments to help me. So medicine's great, but I don't think it can save us if we mean sort out all the problems of our human situation. So science can't solve the problem of racial equality, for example, and science can't save the problem of death. So we might be able to stop people dying as young, or we might be able to stop people dying of a particular virus, but we won't stop people dying. And the Bible says even the fact that we die is a problem. It's not supposed to be that way, let alone the problems of division in society, the problems of guilt and evil, and all of these things. And science can help with some of them, but it can't help the whole thing. And Jesus says that he can heal us of death, and he can even raise the dead. And no scientist has ever claimed that. And if they did, we'd laugh at them. There's no evidence they can do that, but there is evidence that Jesus can do that. So science and Jesus, please. But I'm certainly not saying if you're a Christian, you don't need to bother to go to the doctor. It's a good thing to go to the doctor.
Okay. And I mean, I guess a lot of people would say, yeah, but, come on. So, on the one hand, you've got science, which deals in facts and it deals in truth and it deals in things you can be sure about. And on the other hand, you've got religion, which deals in opinion, and frankly is, you know, you can't prove any of it. And actually, do you know what? It divides us and it causes us to argue with each other. And science is surely the thing that's going to bring us together as human beings and solve, you know, is where our hope needs to be in the future.
There's a few different things there. So is religion divisive? Is religion just opinion? And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, that my big discovery about Jesus was he was a real person in history. And that meant it wasn't a matter of opinion. I mean, people can have different opinions about it, but some opinions will be right and some opinions will be wrong. So if I say Jesus died on a cross just outside Jerusalem to save us from our sins, and a Muslim friend says Jesus didn't die on the cross, and Muslims don't believe that Jesus died in that way, then the one thing that's absolutely certain is we're not both right. I mean, he either died on a cross or he didn't die on a cross, but not both. They're mutually exclusive. And if I say Jesus raised from the dead 3 days later, and an atheist says Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then one of us is wrong. So it's an objective thing, and it's an objective thing that involves facts and eyewitnesses and evidence. Now you might say, oh, it's not scientific evidence because we can't do the forensics. And I mean, it's true that we can't do the forensics, though people at the time could. In fact, they had even better than forensic evidence because they met Jesus after he died and they could check by touching him, giving him food that he ate and so on. So this is, you know, this is even better than checking someone's pulse, is having a conversation with them and touching them. Mm-hmm. So I think it is in the realm of facts and evidence. In terms of science, I think sometimes people talk as though science was automatically the property of the atheist. So there's sort of science equals atheism on one side, and then there's belief in things without evidence, which we call faith, on the other side. And I really deny that description of it. I think science is just a way of finding out things about the world that all of us can use. So saying science belongs to the atheist is like saying food belongs to the Hindu. I mean, all of us can eat food and all of us can do science. And in fact, lots of scientists are Hindus and lots of scientists are Christians and lots of scientists are atheists. So it's not the case that science is automatically on the side of one ideology. Science is just a way of finding things out about the world. So you observe the world, you try and describe what you observe with a hypothesis, and then you try to test that hypothesis with experiments. And it's quite powerful and it's found out lots of things, but it doesn't by itself then answer questions like, so is this world made by a God who loves us and wants to be in a relationship with us, or did this world came about by accident? Science will give you evidence about the world, and then you've got to try and fit it into one of these views. And it seems to me, the more I understand about science, the more it favors Christianity over atheism. So just for example, the Big Bang Theory is a real problem for an atheist, or it was when it was discovered. It's a real headache for the atheist and really good news for the Christian. So the atheists used to think that the world was eternal. It just always been here. Matter was, until relatively recently, people thought that matter had been around forever. And so if it had been around forever, you didn't really have to explain where it came from. Whereas if the universe has a beginning in time, a Big Bang, then the obvious question is, what made the Big Bang go bang? And a Christian says, well, God made the Big Bang go bang, because our Bibles have always told us that in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. So science now agrees with the Bible. Whereas the atheist has got to go, how can something come from nothing without a cause? And it's a problem. So that's just an example of something science shows us that fits quite well with the Bible and doesn't fit very well with atheism. And I could multiply examples. The more we discover about, so my own research was on brain mechanisms in human hearing and how we decode sound, and it's amazing. And there's all sorts of incredible things that happen. And the more I look at it, I think this is really consistent with the idea that there's a God who designed the world brilliantly. And an atheist has to say this is consistent with everything getting very lucky, because we're here by sheer chance. And again, I think the more you find out about the science, the more it favors there's a God who put this together rather than it's an accident. So science is just telling you data, but the atheist and the Christian are both coming to the data and trying to conclude something from it.
So, I mean, I guess, you've brought up creation there, and I guess people would go, hang on a minute, you Christians, your Bible says the world was made in 6 days, the beginning of Genesis. You don't want to go there, do you, Christians? You ought to be keeping quiet about that. Evolution. What would you say in response to that?
Oh yeah, I think I really do want to go there, because I think the Christian narrative of creation, that we're here with a reason because of a God who made it happen, is rational and coherent. And I think the atheist answer, that we're here without a reason and everything that we experience is essentially boils down to chance, isn't coherent and isn't rational. And I could explain that in all sorts of ways. I mean, for example, well, as I said already, changes in something doesn't happen without a cause for it happening. And if there didn't used to be a universe and now there is, something must have caused that. And the Christian says God caused it, and the atheist says I don't know what caused it. A Christian says I'm a rational being because I was made in the image of a rational God. The atheist says I'm a random being, and if my brain is just evolved randomly to ensure its own survival, why should I trust that my brain converges on things that are true? It just wants to converge on things that are surviving. So I shouldn't even really trust my thoughts. My thoughts are only the movement of electrons randomly around a randomly assembled collection of atoms. If we are just atoms, why do we care about racism? I mean, why should we be equal? Because if we're here just by evolution and black people and white people have evolved slightly differently, then why shouldn't one get the upper hand over the other in a survival of the fittest kind of way? I mean, I think that is deeply wrong, and you listening to this will think that's deeply wrong. But why? I mean, the atheist hasn't got a reason for why. The Christian does have a reason for why, because God made human beings in his image with incredible intrinsic value, and he made us black and white and Asian and so on. So lots of things that we sort of instinctively live by are grounded in the Christian narrative of a God who made us, and unravel if you think we're here by accident. In terms of the world being made in 6 days, I mean, this is a question where Christians will take different views, and I guess people watching this YouTube video might have different views. So some Christians say God made the world in 6 24-hour days, and it has the appearance of age, but we got some of the science wrong. That's one line to take. Other Christians say, no, we pretty much agree with mainstream scientific dating. The universe is millions of years old, and the earth has been around a long time. And instead they would say that the days of Genesis chapter 1 are a kind of poetic introduction to the Bible, in which they're not trying to tell you how long it took. It's a kind of symbolic way of speaking, but it's trying to tell you that God carefully ordered everything. And there's some good reason for that. So for example, the sun is made on day 4 in the days of creation, and yet what we mean by a day, astronomically speaking, is the Earth rotating on its axis once relative to the position of the sun, which didn't exist for the first 3 days. So I think there's just clues there that this isn't trying to explain things in terms of how we experience days, but it's a way of saying God's behind the universe. And it's kind of like God's working week. What did you achieve this week? Not very much in lockdown. Just looked at my laptop and tried to smile at the web camera. What did God achieve in a week? Oh, he made the universe. That's the sort of message it's conveying.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, if people want to come back on that, please do put a question in the chat, and we can explore that a bit more. I mean, can I just say one extra thing about evolution? Because I think sometimes people come up with evolution as if it's the one-word answer to the problem of design and complexity in the world. They say, you say God made us, I should say evolution, and that silences the Christian in one word. And I don't think that works. So even to have evolution in the first place, you first have to have an information carrying self-replicating molecule like RNA or DNA, which is one of the most complex chemicals known to science. And the RNA has to contain on it the information encoded in those genetic letters to build even the simplest self-replicating cell,
which is enormously complex. So even before you can have evolution, there's a whole load of stuff that you've got to have first, that there's really no satisfactory explanation of what might be there randomly. Whereas the idea that God would design a phenomenally complicated genetic mechanism, which is really like a computer, I think, yeah, that it fits with there being quite an intelligent God who did this. Again, it doesn't fit. So even evolution itself makes sense within a created world and doesn't make much sense in a random world.
And you know, on that, I mean, people sometimes go, yeah, but we wouldn't be here to observe that unless we had evolved to the point where we could observe this. What do you make of that?
Yeah, right. So that's sometimes called the anthropic principle. And the idea is, if the universe hadn't got lucky enough to make me exist, I wouldn't be asking why did it get lucky enough for me to exist? Therefore, I shouldn't ask the question. And my favorite reply to it, it's a bit of a cheeky one, but it's by John Lennox, who's a professor of maths in Oxford and a Christian, and has written very helpfully on some of these things. But it's a bit like saying, if there's a firing squad and you were sentenced to death and there were 20 crack riflemen all pointing their barrels at you, and the sergeant major says, ready, aim, fire, and they all miss. And then you don't bother to ask why, because you say, well, I wouldn't be here asking why if they hadn't missed. So because they do, I don't need to ask the question. I mean, you know, like, I just don't really, I don't buy it. It's pretty surprising we're here, isn't it? And to tell yourself I'm not supposed to be curious about that, I think it's just an opt-out.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Let's try and explore this. A few minutes ago we talked about the rationality of science, and I guess a lot of people would say Christianity is, you know, inherently irrational. I mean, you pointed to some of the fact that at the heart of Christian faith there are some historical facts and evidence and things that were scientifically observed at the time. People touched and felt and smelt and reported that in the Gospels and that kind of thing. I mean, let's just push this a bit more. I think a lot of people would still want to say, you know, at some level, Christian faith and religion in general requires you to exercise some kind of irrational leap of faith that science doesn't require you to do. You know,
Yeah.
is that in there somewhere?
No, I don't think so. I think it is deeply rational. And the word, one of the problems is just the word faith, because for us, it's become, you know, in our language, faith means a sort of special thing that religious people have that normal people don't have, you know. So, and it's about believing things that you would like to be true without any evidence. And that just isn't what the word means. It just means to trust something. And if you got any sense, you only trust things that you got good reason to trust. And the Bible is always giving us reasons to trust it. So I can't think of anywhere in the Bible that you're told to believe something without being given a reason why. Now, of course, you can check out those reasons and say, are they good reasons? Do they support the weight of my trust? And I'm suggesting to you, they really do. But you're certainly never asked in the Bible to abandon your reason or to make a decision without reasons. There's always reasons. I think one of the problems, so something like miracles, you know, I used to think, when I was an atheist, I used to think, oh, well, of course, the Bible's nonsense because it contains miracles and they're impossible. But it's a very circular kind of thinking that I hadn't really spotted about myself. Because what I was basically saying was, there's no God. The universe is entirely material. It's just matter and chance. And it's governed by the laws of nature. And there's no mechanism within the laws of nature and matter and chance that would make a miracle happen. So it didn't happen. Okay, so, but actually all I've done is I've smuggled the conclusion in at the start in my premises, because I started by saying there's no God and the world's only material. Okay, what if I was wrong about those starting assumptions? So what if there is a God and God's extremely powerful, and if he wants to, he can do a miracle anytime he wants? Now, God doesn't usually do miracles, which is why they're miracles, because by definition, they're very unusual things, right? If half the time that someone went fishing, they could walk on the water, then when Jesus walked in the water, no one would be surprised. They just go, oh, that happens half the time. You know, you'd have to revise your law of the displacement of water or something. And if sometimes 2 bread rolls was enough, or 5 bread rolls was enough to feed 5,000 people, then the feeding of the 5,000 wouldn't have got anyone talking. But because that is never, ever usually enough bread, then a miracle is God messing with the usual laws of science to get our attention. But actually, let me put the other way around. I think actually that's exactly what we'd expect, isn't it? Imagine I were to say to you, and imagine we're not just meeting on YouTube, because there could be all sorts of special effects, but we're meeting in real life. And I say to you, well, you're lucky to meet me because actually I'm your creator. I made the universe. And you say, really? Like a little bit suspiciously, prove it, please. And I say, oh no, well, I can't prove it because I can't do anything that, you know, you can't do because I'm, and then you'd be like, shut up. And you go and call the psychiatric hospital. So the claim to be the creator of the universe, wouldn't it be quite surprising if Jesus didn't do some unusual things? Like if he actually made us, if he made the stars, wouldn't I expect a boat trip to him with him to go a little bit unusually? So far from miracles being a problem, I now think, well, the miracles are entirely consistent with the claims that Jesus is making. And if there weren't any miracles, then I would be suspicious. But the trouble is sometimes we end up smuggling in our conclusion at the start. And maybe you're watching this YouTube and you're thinking, I've already decided there's no God. Therefore, I've decided Jesus isn't God. Therefore, this is rubbish. But you've kind of, if I can be really cheeky, you're just expressing a blind faith in an atheistic starting point that is impervious to any other evidence. And I would invite you to think, well, maybe my hypothesis was wrong. And that's what science always does, isn't it? You come up with a theory, and then when you get data that doesn't fit the theory, you revise the theory. So if your theory is there's no God, and you come across a resurrection of Jesus, and you think the resurrection of Jesus doesn't fit with my theory that there's no God, you've got two options. You either bury the evidence or you revise your theory. And I suggest the more scientific thing to do is to revise your theory. Maybe there is a God.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here from the chat. I think getting back, we're kind of jumping between questions, but getting back to the how we've got lucky in the world. What about the multiverse theory? What do you make of that? You maybe explain what that is.
Yeah, well, the idea is that it's way too lucky. This universe is way too lucky, which I agree with. And then you've got two options, right? So either the numbers aren't random and someone picked them, which is what, as a Christian, I think, that God designed it very carefully, or you've got to have some other explanation for how lucky it got. And one suggestion is maybe there's infinitely many universes, because if you can try the experiment infinitely many times, one of them is going to get lucky. Now that's really interesting as a theory, but I want to notice straight away it's not really a scientific theory, because and this was a point made in a review of M theory in the journal Nature, the scientific journal, and the person reviewing it said, well, this isn't a repeatable or an observable or a testable theory, which are really the three criteria for science. So you could see the data which say this universe is extremely surprising and unlikely, and then you could decide, instead of believing in God, I prefer to have faith in the unproven idea of there being infinitely many universes. And yeah, sure, you could do that if you want. But at least as long as you admit that what you're doing is moving from the science to a belief that you've come up with to make sense of it. I don't mind if you do that, because that's what you're saying I'm doing. But now we're both doing that, right? So we're basing evidence and then come up with a theory. And your theory is infinite universes, and my theory is there's a God. And then you can test those theories. And my reason for there being a God isn't just the universe is surprising. It's the universe is surprising. And 2,000 years ago, a man came, he said he was God, he died and rose again. And I think by that point, it clinches it. The multiverse theory, I don't know how you would test it. And it's also pretty strange in some of its implications, because it means that not only do you not have to be surprised by the universe being here, but you don't have to be surprised by anything, because every possible version of the universe is going to happen somewhere. So as well as the universe where we finished this Zoom call, there's the version where ball lightning appears in my bedroom and vaporizes me now. Oh no, we're not in that version of the universe. But if we were, you shouldn't be surprised, because everything that's happened to you also hasn't happened in every possible combination in the billions and billions of infinitely number of yous that there are watching different laptop screens and different, I just think it's a faith position. It makes a lot less sense. It starts getting really crazy.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, and so, I mean, we've emphasized the need to assess, the evidence of Christianity as much as we assess the evidence for anything else. What about, I mean, pushing on Genesis again, question, what about the flood account, and how does this fit with the conservation of water molecules in the world?
This is great. Thank you for somebody who obviously knows a lot about physics. Yeah, I mean, there are some miracles. I sometimes chat with Christian friends who are scientists about which miracle is the hardest for God to do, sort of scientifically. And some of them are, amazing, like Jesus coming back from the dead. That's amazing, but it's not maybe as scientifically difficult as, and we reckon this feeding of the 5,000 is pretty difficult because Jesus starts with 5 bread loaves, he feeds 5,000 people, and then they collect up more leftovers than they started with. So it's the same argument. They end up with more bread. There's more bread molecules at the end than there at the start. So, what are you doing? And I kind of think, well, it's the same argument really. If there's a God, he can do whatever he wants. And I quite like the fact that he does really, really hard things, because otherwise sometimes Christian, and I've heard people try to explain the miracles away in a sort of scientific way. So, Jesus walked on water because maybe there was a sandbank that no one had ever noticed that was just below the surface, or the burning bush at the time of Moses happened because there was a venting of volcanic gas that was on fire, but the bush wasn't on fire. And, people try these ingenious things, and I just love that there's some miracles in the Bible you just can't do that for, because they're so difficult that they really God would have to mess up the physics of the world. And I think, well, why shouldn't he? Because and partly it's the problem that we assume that the laws of physics are absolutely inviolable. You cannot ever change them, but we haven't really got a rational reason for saying that. It's just an observation that they apply consistently with everything we observe, and they apply very consistently. But what if all we're looking at is actually the fact that God is consistent in the way that he sustains the universe? What if the gravitational constant is something that God chooses, and Planck's constant is in his hands, and he just chooses to keep Planck's constant the same, because if he changed it, it caused all sorts of problems. But that doesn't mean that he couldn't change it and make all the other adjustments to everything else in the universe that would be required. You suddenly get more matter. You think, well, what's going to happen to the gravitational field? And also, but that's the whole point of a miracle. God does something really, really hard to get your attention. But if your view of science is we're just describing the world that God sustains in existence, and the only reason we can make scientific laws is because God sustains the universe very consistently, that doesn't mean he can't do it differently if he wanted to. So it's just I guess it's the same. I'm making the same argument.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. Another question, which I mean is we sort of covered, but it says my friend is convinced he's descended from the monkeys, or at least shares common ancestry with them. I don't think that's the band, the Monkeys. I think that's. But is he right?
That's our generation, Tom. I think most people are thinking, "What is this?"
Is he right? If so, how do you square it with the biblical account?
So we obviously have genetic similarities with other mammals, and in fact even with insects. There's those great statistics of we have 85% of DNA in common with a ladybird, or whatever. So of course there are some biological templates that are similar in different species, and I think the distinct thing that the Bible says clearly is that human beings aren't just the same as other animals. There is something qualitatively different about a human being, because only of human beings is it said in the Bible that we're made in God's image, and that is a position of incredible dignity. It's not just that I'm an ape that got a little bit further ahead evolutionarily, and that I have disposable thumbs or whatever, and I have language. Or it's not just on a continuum, but there's something special about a human being, because we're made to know God and to relate to him and to be his representatives in the world as the bearers of his image. And then God cared so much about human beings that he became a human being. So Jesus wasn't a sparrow, and there's a reason for that, because it's the human race that God loves and who are made in his image, and he came to save. So the Bible is very human-centered, and I guess that would upset some environmentalists. They say, why should our species be special? And the Bible says it is special. That shouldn't be to the harm of the environment, because God's given human beings in his image the responsibility to care for the whole of the world and the whole of creation. but we are especially valuable as human beings. And again, I think that's something that we're starting to lose, because if we're hit in our society, if we become more atheistic, we're here just by chance. If we're here just by chance, humans don't have such intrinsic value. And you end up with awful things like, if I become old and senile, should you terminate me so that I'm not a burden on society? Or if someone's born mentally disabled, should you kill them after birth? And frightening things that if value is located just in how advanced I am rather than who God's made me to be, then I think God's made every human being to be precious in his sight because of we're image bearers.
Thank you. We're getting into the last few minutes, really. So, I mean, if you've got a question and you're watching and you haven't put it in the chat, now's your chance, and we might get to maybe one more. Let's take it back to COVID-19. Richard Dawkins famously talks about how he reckons he's got a better explanation for suffering in the world, precisely because all that's behind the world is blind, pitiless indifference, is his phrase. And I guess some would say, well, that is a better explanation for why bad things happen, because there is no explanation. And you Christians, you believe in a God who you claim is sovereign and in control and loving, and yet he's allowing pandemics and much, much worse through human history. How would you answer that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tom. I mean, it's a really good question. It's probably another whole evening, I guess, just to even scratch the surface of it. But the first thing to say is, if the universe is random numbers, you don't get to ask any questions about it. It doesn't make sense to even ask why. It's a bit like saying, why did this person die of cancer? It's like saying, why did I pressed the random number key on my calculator at school and I got the number 7. Why is that? I mean, there isn't a reason. It's just a non-question. And it sort of shuts everything down. Whereas as humans, we are asking why. And I'm not saying this makes Christianity easier, because now it turns the question up. There's a God who's behind it. Then why? But the atheist doesn't even get to ask the question. It's the first thing I'd say. And the second thing, I mean, the Bible gives an account of the world, which I think makes exact sense of what we see. Namely, the world is beautiful and the world is spoiled. And actually you get that story just in the first 3 chapters of the Bible. So in chapter 1, God makes the world and it's really good. He makes human beings in his image. It's a wonderful place. And by chapter 3 of the Bible, the beautiful world has got wrecked and it's fractured and spoiled and relationships are on the rocks. And it's all because we've turned our back on the God that made us to know him. And the rest of the Bible story, that's just the first 3 chapters of the Bible. The rest of the Bible is all about how God's going to fix it. Now, I actually think that just those 3 things to say, God made a good world, it got messed up and we need to be fixed, I think makes absolute sense of what we observe. So you don't say, a black man in Minneapolis was crushed to death by a police officer, but I mean, just random atoms really, and the police officer's thoughts were just the moving of electrons around his brain, and I don't really care. I mean, if you've seen it or heard about it, you are extremely distraught and troubled and think this should not be like this. But the atheist can't explain that. Why shouldn't it? It's just random. It's just what happened in a corner of a random universe. Whereas those 3 truths about the Christian view of the world, God made the world and it's supposed to be good. Human beings are valuable, but it isn't good. You shouldn't be killing people like this on the streets of America. And yet I desperately want something to be done about it to fix it. Actually is precisely the Bible's view of the world. We're in a mess. We need to be rescued. And Jesus come to rescue us so that we can be reconciled to the God that made us, so that the world can be put right. And I think that makes sense. So the problem of suffering is it's like a way of saying something is wrong. And the Bible agrees something is wrong. And COVID-19 says to us, and maybe we need the wake-up call, because we're so successful as a society and so advanced in medicine that we almost thought that we were invincible, didn't we, like a year ago? And now the whole world has been brought to its knees, medically, economically, and I guess that's going to come soon, isn't it? All the job losses, and we'll realize that we're very fragile and something is wrong. And of course, Jesus has been saying to us, something's wrong. And I think what we're seeing in the world just chimes in with the Bible's diagnosis. We've got a problem, we need saving, and we need a savior. And the doctors might be able to save us from COVID-19. They won't save us from death and evil and violence, but Jesus will.
Thank you. If you want to explore that more, you could watch the video from 2 weeks ago with Jeremy Marshall, where we looked into his experiences of suffering with incurable cancer and living with that, and he gave some perspectives on that as well. But it's a big question, as you say. We could speak a lot longer on it. Okay, I have got one more question before we round it off, and it takes us into your specialist subject of neuroscience. So how would you explain to people who say Christians are brainwashed from a neuroscience perspective? YouTube wanted to censor this because it was worried about Christians are brainwashed, I think. So it's asked me to say I'm okay with it, which is fine. So, the neuroscience is the big thing at the moment, isn't it? Everything can be explained by neuroscience, and more people are explaining it, all aspects of human behavior by the latest neuroscience. And they might want to say, yeah, but the reason you believe in Jesus is because you've been brainwashed in some way. Can you help us with that?
I mean, the insight from neuroscience is that we are not infinitely rational, and that our brains can be deceived, and we've got to be careful about what we think. And I think that, again, the Bible really agrees with that. So, but that it cuts both ways. So how do you know you're not brainwashed to be an atheist? Right. And actually, some people say, oh, you're Christian because you're born in a Christian country. People used to say it to me, and I cheekily reply, you're an atheist because you're born in an atheist country. It cuts both ways, this argument. Are you just influenced by people around you? I think it's easiest when you go back to the time of Jesus and the people who met him and staked their lives on what they reported him to have said and done, and think, what was it that convinced them? So rather than just asking me, am I brainwashed? And probably I am wrong about some things. Why not go back to the first Christians and say, were they brainwashed? Was Jesus a con man who manipulated their psychology so that they all were convinced? And rather than asking that, I could give you an answer, but I think the best way to do it is I'd love to invite you to read one of the first century biographies of Jesus, and ask and look for the answer to that question. So say, people concluded that Jesus was God. I want to know, on what basis did they conclude that? And were they being rational when they concluded that? And is it possible that they were deceived into concluding that? And by all means, ask those critical questions as you read one of the accounts of what Jesus reportedly said and did. And that's the thing I'd love you to do it, because I'd never done it. So I've made up my whole mind about Jesus based on, well, not YouTube, because the internet wasn't really invented when I was at school, but just based on Channel 4 documentaries and things like that, and hearsay. If you're interested in evidence, look at some of the evidence and evaluate it, and just think, what convinced them? And I think what convinced them was really persuasive, undeniable facts. And you might suspect, oh no, they were just gullible. Well, check it out and see how gullible you think they were. That's my challenge to you.
Thank you. That is, in many ways, is a great note to end on. And we're going to offer people the opportunity to look into these questions a little bit more. We're going to do a short 3-week course that we're calling Christianity in a Nutshell, from Tuesday, the 30th of June. And that's sort of 10 days time, 3 Tuesday evenings, just exploring some of these big questions that Andrew's been raising. If you want to know more about that, go onto our website, and there's a button on the front page that says Christianity Explored. Click on that and find Christianity in a Nutshell. You can also send me an email. So tom@sjdh.org. Just send me a one-line email that says you're interested in this. Can I have more details? No, no commitment. Just at this stage, just I'll send you the details. It'd be great to hear from you. Andrew, just to sort of 30 seconds. We all remember chemistry at school, and we're sort of it was interesting at the time. Maybe for some of us, we've forgotten most of it now. A lot of people think these things don't really, science for many isn't actually all that interesting or important. What is Christianity different? Where's the urgency? Why does this matter?
I mean, it just matters in so many ways. I mean, if you care about life and death, it matters because Jesus says he's got the answer to death. If you care about good and evil, it matters because Jesus says he's got the solution to evil. If you care about racial inequality, it matters because Jesus says he's got the key to the unity of the human race. I mean, just in every level, it matters. But ultimately, I think it's not just about, is this true? Remember I said right at the start, I used to think, well, firstly, I thought it was just wishful thinking. Then I thought this is a true false question. And I thought it's true. And then I thought the question is, can I trust Jesus to not direct my life? And Jesus isn't just offering us some facts, although he is offering us facts. He's offering us a relationship with a God who loves us and is good and wants life and liberty and unity and everything that we long for. And so my testimony to you personally is it's been a really good thing to follow Jesus, and he's been very trustworthy, and my life didn't get wrecked, and he doesn't go around turning wine into water, and it'd be a really good idea to follow him. So, but obviously that's only true if it's based on the facts. By all means, check out the facts. But what we're being offered is a relationship with a living God who made us and loves us.
Thank you. So tom@sjdh.org, or go to our website, sjdh.org. Christianity in a Nutshell, Tuesday, the 30th of June. We're also, this was our third of 4 COVID conversations, and you can catch the other ones on YouTube where you are right now. And in a week's time, we're going to have our 4th and final one. And that is going to be on the subject of race, racism, COVID, and Christ. And this is obviously a big question for us in our culture at the moment. I'm delighted to be able to be interviewing Andrew Barnett from London City Mission. And his day job is working with people who live in the area around the Grenfell Tower in West London. So we are going to be hearing his experiences, his experience as a person of colour growing up in this country, and his thoughts as a Christian on race, racism, COVID, and Christ. So do join us a week's time, 8 o'clock Thursday next week, same place here, and we will be delighted to see you then. Meanwhile, thanks for joining us this evening, and goodbye. Thanks, and thank you to Andrew for joining us.
Tom.
It's been
nice
brilliant.
to see you
And there's so much thanks in the chat as well. I think people have really appreciated it. So great to see you, Andrew. And
thank you.
See you soon, everyone. Bye-bye.